Bihar's 2025 election, wow. It wasn't just a loss for the mahagathbandhan alliance, it was a total, absolute collapse. So you have to ask, why? How did one side win so overwhelmingly? Well, in this explainer, we're going to break down the anatomy of this political landslide. To really get what happened, you have to start with this number, around 202. Think about it. Out of 243 seats in the entire Bihar Assembly, the National Democratic Alliance, the NDA, walked away with a massive 202. I mean, that's not just a win, that is total dominance. And just look at the gap. It's huge. The NDA just soared past that 200-seat mark, while the MGB alliance was left with, maybe 33 seats? This was not a close race. Not by any stretch. It was a political landslide, plain and simple. So that's the big question, right? How on earth does a major political alliance just collapse so completely? We've seen what happened. Now it's time to dig into the why. All right, first up, setting the stage. Before we can really get into the nuts and bolts of the result, we've got to understand the battlefield. Let's rewind a bit and set the stage for how this all went down. So you've got these two huge forces going head-to-head. On one side, there's the NDA, with the BJP really in the driver's seat of the campaign. And on the other, you have the mahagathbandhan, or MGB, led by the RJD, which was fighting hard to take back control of the state. And of course, you can't talk about Bihar politics without mentioning the pivotal figure of Nitish Kumar, whose decisions can, and often do, completely change the game. And what's really interesting here is that this election wasn't really fought on some high-level abstract ideas. Nope. It was all about the real, on-the-ground stuff, especially when you think about Bihar's massive youth population. For them, things like jobs, the need to migrate for work, the state of the roads, these weren't just talking points. These were the things that defined their daily lives, and you can bet they shaped how people voted. All right, Section 2, votes versus seats. This brings us to a really critical point. To truly understand this landslide, we have to look past that final seat count and get into the nitty-gritty of how votes actually turn into seats, because they're not always the same thing. And that's where this key idea called strike rate comes in. Basically, it's not just about how many people vote for you overall. What really matters is how good you are at turning those votes into actual wins in specific seats. You could say it's the ultimate measure of how efficient your campaign really is. And this, right here, is the absolute core of the MGB's structural problem. Their votes were all packed into a few areas, so yeah, they'd win in their strongholds by a huge margin, but all those extra votes, they were basically wasted because they didn't help them win anywhere else. Now look at the NDA. Their votes were spread out much more evenly. That meant they could pick up wins all over the state, even if by smaller margins. So what's the bottom line here? The MGB piled up a ton of votes, but the NDA was way smarter about where their votes landed, and that's how they racked up the seats. Okay, moving on to Section 3, strategy and ground game. So you have this big structural problem with the vote distribution, right? Well, that was made a whole lot worse by some major differences in strategy. Let's get into the campaign itself and see how this thing was really won and lost on the ground. I mean, the two campaigns were like night and day. The NDA's campaign was like a well-oiled machine, super disciplined, clear leadership, and one consistent message about development that they hammered home again and again. The MGB, on the other hand, well, it was a different story. You had a lot of infighting, which led to a messy, inconsistent message. And their whole strategy seemed to be based on these massive rallies instead of building a solid booth-by-booth organization.
And look, this wasn't just some high-level squabbling. These problems trickled all the way down to the grassroots level. You had arguments over who should even run in certain seats, and you even had workers from the different allied parties clashing with each other. All of this just completely weakened their campaign where it counts the most, on the ground, in the villages and towns.
And that really is the heart of the matter, isn't it? Sure, the MGB had these huge, impressive rallies with massive crowds, but the NDA had something much more powerful, an incredible ground game. We're talking about a massive network of workers at every single polling booth, going door to door, making sure their voters actually showed up. And in the end, that proved to be way more effective at winning those tight races. Another thing the NDA did incredibly well was they made sure voters connected the government's work with actual benefits in their own lives. They were constantly talking about things like cash transfers and specific welfare programs, which was a very direct pitch to really important voter groups like women and people in rural areas. And you know what? That message landed. It worked.
Finally, Section 4, the path forward. So, okay, we've looked at the numbers, we've looked at the strategy. What's the big takeaway here? What does a defeat this big really mean for the future of alliances like this? Not just in Bihar, but maybe even across the country. You know, if you look closely, the lessons from this loss almost create a kind of playbook for what needs to happen next. First off, you absolutely need clear, united leadership. Second, you have to build that booth-level network. Rallies alone just won't cut it. Third, you've got to get smarter about strategy. Stop just protecting your strongholds and actually go out and fight for those swing seats. And maybe most importantly, you need one single, powerful message that everyone in the alliance is pushing. So at the end of the day, here's what it all boils down to. The MGB's loss wasn't just some fluke. It wasn't just a bad night. It was, at its core, a structural failure. It was a failure to turn votes into seats, a failure of their ground game, and a failure of the alliance to hold together. And all of those weaknesses were expertly exploited by a much more disciplined opponent. Which leaves us with the big question. Can they actually fix these deep structural issues? Because the clock is already ticking for the next election.